Hey everybody, this is Pastor Mark. Thanks so much for being here on this Sunday morning or whenever it is that you choose to watch this message. Thank you for watching. Today, in week number 3 of our series on forgiveness, we're going to talk about the subject of how to forgive, as well as barriers to forgiveness. Some people just want to know, how in the world am I ever supposed to forgive? And others, knowing how to forgive, ask, how could I possibly ever do that? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today, and I really think it's going to be helpful to you. So we're going to get into that content here in just a moment. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for watching. Take a moment right now, click like, click share, click subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment. I promise I'll read it. I cannot promise I'll respond, but the encouraging words are always welcome. Again, thank you for being here. We'll get into today's message in just a moment. Okay, well, it is moving on towards fall here in New England, and I'm sitting here in my office recording this message, and I have my Ember coffee mug. Ember is a smart coffee mug that my wife got for me because I'm an idiot. But anyway, the Ember mug keeps your coffee at exactly the temperature that you choose. It's unlike some of those cheaper versions that just heat it up and they keep it, hot at whatever it is. You can actually choose using an app on your phone to have the coffee kept at a certain temperature. It will notify you when your coffee reaches that temperature, and then it will let you know, I guess, when the mug is empty or whatever. It's just a fancy coffee mug, but I have my coffee here and I'm going to take a sip of it here now. I encourage you to grab a cup of coffee if you haven't already. I know some of you are watching in your pajamas. I am not watching in my pajamas, at least as far as you can tell. The perfect sip of the perfect cup of coffee. Okay, I won't do that anymore on camera the rest of the day today. I hope you'll forgive me for that. If you don't know how, I'm going to show you in just a moment. I'm laughing a little bit, but forgiveness is not an easy thing, is it? It's really not. As I've said throughout this series, forgiveness is probably the number one thing that I have counseled people over. The difficulty of forgiveness, the unwillingness to forgive, the feeling like I can never forgive that person because if I do, then they're going to get away with something. I hope you've taken time to watch last week's message, and if you haven't, pause this right now and go watch last week's message. 4 categories related to forgiveness. It's really important that you understand it. It underlies everything I'm going to say here. Not that you won't get anything out of this message without knowing it, but I encourage you to do so, and you can come back and watch this later. For those of you still watching now, let's proceed. Today I want to talk to you and give you a couple of how-tos. I've got some charts to show you, some things that I think are going to help you make some sense of this and stick in your mind. I've got 3 alliterated action steps that you can take to learn how to forgive. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into the slides this morning. How to forgive and barriers to forgiveness. I'm wondering if you're struggling with forgiving in some area in your life, and maybe after listening to last week's message, you have identified, okay, the thing I'm struggling to forgive, it's more of in the mistake, the low-level sins, the things that aren't necessarily wrong, but they get on my nerves, and if left to fester, could become big things. Maybe you're struggling with a trespass against you, where somebody intentionally or unintentionally did something actually wrong, and you're struggling to forgive that. Maybe it rises to the level of debt, where somebody took something from you that was yours, or they failed to give you something that you were owed, and so you feel like they owe that to you, and you're struggling with just letting that go. It could be a literal debt. Sometimes sometimes it's a literal debt that stands between two people. I never loan money to friends because I don't want that debt to become a barrier between us. And so maybe it's an actual debt that has become a debt because they're not they're not paying you back like they promised they would. And you're wondering, what do I do about that? Can I let that go? Should I let that go? That's probably a whole nother topic. But my point is, maybe you're struggling with something that rises to the level of a debt. Hopefully not, but maybe you're also struggling with something that rises to the level of an offense. And you've been told by people, just forgive. Jesus forgave you, so you also should forgive. And of course, that verse is in the Bible. But we talked last week and started the conversation about offenses, and we're going to come back to that towards the end of the message today. But it's a hard thing, isn't it? How can I forgive, and how do I overcome the barriers to forgiveness in my life? I'm paraphrasing from the Gospels here, but this is a statement that the Apostle Peter asked of Jesus after Jesus gave some pretty hard words, or some pretty strong words, about forgiveness. Peter asked him, how many times do I have to forgive a brother or a sister who hurts me? Is 7 times enough? Because there's part of us, I think, that always wants to look for that end line, that finish line. Like, if I forgive this person this many times and now that's it, I forgave you 7 times, but that 8th time you're on your own, bud. That's it. Washed up. You're out of here. I'm done with you. I have nothing more to give you related to forgiveness. Without a doubt, it is hard to forgive when the person does the same thing over and over and over again. And especially when we're not talking about offenses now. We're talking about trespasses, maybe debts, definitely mistakes. Many of the couples that I have counseled over the years have an accrued bag full of mistakes. That once was one thing, twice was another thing, but oh my goodness, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you. I can't forgive that. Like, if you do it once, then I can forgive it. Twice, maybe, but who would even do it 7 times? But so I think Peter was even reaching out a little bit with hyperbole, but reaching out a little bit far. Like, this would be really something, Lord. Do you know anybody that's forgiven somebody for something 7 times? I know there's a wife that's probably watching saying, my husband has forgotten to put his dirty clothes in the laundry basket 7,000 times in the years we've been married, and I always forgive him. And yet you remember it, don't you? But the point of the matter is that forgiveness is a challenge. Forgiveness is a difficult thing. How do we do it? And the question is, how often do we have to do it? Well, I want to encourage you in the message today to live in an attitude of forgiveness. Live in an attitude of forgiveness, that forgiveness should become a part of who you are. And that's not always an easy thing, but hopefully it's something that we'll learn to do. Where's your meter when it comes to forgiveness right now? I'm looking at this slide now and I'm thinking that's a bit of an odd graphic. I wonder who created that. I think I did. I should fire myself. No, I'm going to forgive myself. That's something we haven't talked about yet. But where's your meter? We have 2 images here on the screen. We have a gas meter down into the red. Everybody knows that in the red means your gas is almost empty. The other guy has his pockets turned inside out to show he has no money. Forgiveness is like currency. Forgiveness is like fuel. And some of you are struggling because your forgiveness tank is all the way on empty, and you feel like you've spent all the forgiveness currency you have. Or maybe that one person, you feel like they've spent all the goodwill that you have, and you have nothing left for them. Here's the thing. An attitude of forgiveness is very much like fuel or like resources. It's not a resource that cannot be used up. It's a resource that needs to be replenished. Okay? It needs to be replenished. And if we're not in the habit of replenishing the resource of our attitude of forgiveness, we're going to run on empty. And some of you are there today. And so we're going to talk first and foremost about how to replenish that attitude of forgiveness. I don't know who said it, but it's an important thing to remember that you can't pour out of an empty cup. If your heart is not prepared to forgive, and if you have not replenished your heart and replenished your soul when it comes to the attitude of forgiveness towards other people, you're going to be called upon to forgive, and that's when you're just going to explode and everything's going to blow up, and you're going to be like, that's it, that's done, I'm not doing this anymore, I've had it, I can only just take just so much. What are we saying when we say, I can only take just so much? It's usually talking about the level of our meter. Now, even as I'm saying that, I recognize that some would want to use that to say that you should just lay down and let people, wipe their feet on you like a doormat. Not only did Christ not say any such of a thing, but neither am I saying that. I'm not arguing that there aren't times when we need to say enough is enough to a certain action. But our actions and reactions towards people who are constantly sinning against us or trespassing against us, if somebody constantly borrows money and I forgive that debt over and over again, there may come a time when I stop giving them money. I stop loaning them money to avoid that. So obviously there are times when we have to draw lines, but it should never be that, I no longer have the capacity to forgive this person. That's something we should be worried about. But maybe you're struggling with how to forgive. See, I don't even know how to do it because you don't find inside of you the resources necessary to forgive. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about this in relation to a forgiveness cycle, okay? A forgiveness cycle. And this is something that is repetitive because I'm sorry to tell you, but in your life, you are always going to need to forgive. There will always be a need to forgive. And in any relationship that you have, especially the ones that are worth having, you will be needing to forgive on a regular basis. And in order to do that, you're going to need to go through this forgiveness cycle to make sure that your gas tank is full, because when those resources are depleted, you need to put more into the tank. I've been driving the vehicle that I currently drive. I've been driving it every day for the past, I don't know actually how many years I've had it now. 2 or 3 years, I think, approaching 4 years. But the tank only has like a 13.5 gallon tank. The reason I can drive it every day is because I watch that meter, and when it gets low, I fill it up with gas again. Well, we can't expect to go through life allowing our forgiveness meter to run to empty and never replenish it, because sooner or later you're going to need it. There's going to be a draw on those resources, and it's going to be empty. So the first thing that we need to do with the forgiveness cycle is contemplation. Contemplation. So I'm going to look here at 1 John chapter number 3. I'm going to pull it up here in just a moment, but you can turn there or swipe there in your Bible. 1 John chapter number 3 and verse number 1. And I think this is, here we go. Let's look at this together. 1 John chapter 3 and verse number 1. Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. Therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not. But let me focus on that first part of the verse. Behold, that means really look at this. Contemplation. Spend time thinking about the love of God for us, God's forgiveness of us, the way God responds to us. Spend some time really meditating and contemplating on how often we have come to God for forgiveness of our sins, or when we've made a mistake and we experience the love of God and we forgive and we experience the forgiveness of God. Contemplating the nature of God as it relates to love and mercy and forgiveness is an important thing. And here's the reason why. Because I think I said this in a previous message, but I say it to our church a lot recently. You tend to become like the thing you meditate on or focus on. People tend to become like the gods they worship. Whether it's money, whether it's a false god or an idol, whether it's a wrong view of God, whatever deity you spend time focusing on, you will become like that deity. When we focus on the attributes of our Father in heaven, we can be merciful even as our Father in heaven is merciful. When we focus on the right things, we do the right things, or we feel the right way. Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. Jesus said, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart bringeth forth good things. An evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart bringeth forth evil things. For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. Right? So what we meditate on, Solomon said, keep your heart or guard your heart. He's talking about the center of your emotions and your mind, where your thoughts are. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. In other words, whatever's in your heart comes out. So it's important then that we contemplate and meditate on the right things. So when we contemplate and meditate on the forgiveness of God toward us and towards the world and towards sinners and all of those things, when we think about that all the time and we meditate on it and contemplate on it, it changes us. We will be more likely, or we ought to be more likely. In fact, Jesus told that story, and we might actually get to one verse of it here in a minute, but Jesus told the story of the servant, and I mentioned it last week, who had been forgiven a debt, but then he went out and held a much smaller debt against his fellow servant. And the Lord was very angry, the Lord in the passage, not God, but the Lord was very angry with his servant because he said, I forgave you so much. You should have forgiven your fellow servant. Why didn't he? Because he didn't spend time thinking about everything that he had been forgiven and how good that felt. And because he was only thinking about what was owed to him, his actions corresponded to that. So contemplation is the first step in the forgiveness cycle. Okay, let's look back at the forgiveness cycle here together, and we'll look at assimilation. Assimilation, and this is Luke 7:47. Now, I think on your slides it says Luke 6:47. That is an error, but I didn't have time to go in and change it. Hopefully I will before I preach the message in church on Sunday. But Luke 7, like the airplane, 7:47. Okay, this is the story of Jesus and the woman who came and anointed his feet. And let's look at verse number 47, which is right here. Jesus said, Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. Assimilation. This is not only thinking about God's forgiveness in general, but assimilating and allowing that to change us, to affect our attitudes about forgiveness, our attitudes towards God, our attitudes towards others. People that have been forgiven little tend to show little forgiveness. Assimilation means to become, to take as our own something that we either see or that is given to us or that we contemplate. To assimilate it, to say, Lord, I want my attitude to be affected by what I know. I'm contemplating your forgiveness, and I want to assimilate your attitude as my own. Again, Jesus said, Be ye therefore merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. Assimilate God's attitude as our own. Assimilate God's character as our own. Be like our Father who is in heaven. Be like the Lord Jesus Christ. Meditation or contemplation and assimilation. All right? Contemplation and assimilation. Number 3, allocation. Allocation. And this is Matthew 18:33. Matthew 18:33. And I'm going to get right over there. I want you to see these verses. I could just read them to you, but I want you to see them. Okay, so Matthew 18:33, it says this. This is that verse or story. You can read it in Matthew 18 about the Lord and the servant, and he forgave him, and then he didn't forgive his fellow servant, and all that I've talked about. But verse number 33, down towards the end of the story, here's the question that the master in the story asks the servant who had been forgiven but refused to forgive. He said, Shouldest not thou also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity on thee? So this is the third step in that process. He said, I forgave you. Shouldn't you have forgiven others? So 3 mistakes were made by this servant. 1, he didn't contemplate what his Lord had done for him. 2, he didn't assimilate his Lord's attitude as his own. And 3rd, he didn't allocate the forgiveness that he had assimilated to others around him. So God has forgiven me, and then I want to become a forgiver. I want the forgiveness and the love of God to fill me up. And then as needs are presented to me, as debts are presented to me, as sins are presented to me, I allocate forgiveness. I'm not giving away all of my forgiveness. I'm just giving away a portion of my forgiveness. I'm allocating it. I'm giving it out. You could also call this a dispensation of forgiveness, not in the sense that people use it in relation to time, but to dispense forgiveness. Contemplate, assimilate, allocate. Now, that's not that hard, is it? It's a simple thing to do. So if you're struggling with forgiveness, and again, I'm talking about in the first three categories right now, if you're struggling with forgiveness, with forgiving someone for the things that they've done, especially if it just really has gotten under your skin, instead of worrying about forgiving them right at this very moment, I want you to take some time this week and contemplate God's forgiveness of you and God's forgiveness of others. Read the passages in the Gospels that talk about how God forgives. Go look up the word forgiveness in the book of Psalms and read those verses. Meditate on them, because as you do that, you will begin to become like those things, and you can assimilate that into your character. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So if forgiveness is filling up your heart and mind, then it will be much easier for you to then give to others as you have been given. You will be able to forgive in the same manner that you have been forgiven. I hope that's making sense. I need to move along here to the next slide. Let's go ahead and look at this flow chart here, and I'm going to get over here where I can see a little bit bigger here. I have three things that in relation to how and overcoming barriers, how to forgive and overcoming barriers. This is a flow chart of steps that you can take when you're not sure if you should forgive, not sure how to forgive, not sure what kind of thing you're dealing with, and how to go about it. Again, this is just practical this week on here's how you go through this process. You have the forgiveness cycle. Now I want to give you a flow chart, and there are three words in this flow chart: analyze, ask, and act. Analyze, ask, and act. The first one, analyze, means, or I have underneath here, identify the action, analysis, really figure out what we're dealing with. The truth of the matter is, sometimes there's nothing, it's just, we're mistaken in our assumption of what it is that happens. Sometimes it's not what we think it is. I remember one time being very angry because I saw two people talking in the corner, and one of them looked my way, and I knew they were talking about me. You know how I knew it? Because I can read minds and hearts. And also I can't. And neither can you. We pride ourselves on being able to read people. Like, oh, I could read people. I could read people like books. Like, I don't know what kind of books it is that you're reading, but I cannot tell you the number of mistaken and false ideas that people have held against each other when a conversation would have cleared it up. But in this case, I saw those two people talking, and I knew they were talking about me, and it bothered me all day long, and I was very angry about it. And I thought, well, I just need to forgive them for it. And I remember talking to someone about it, a mentor about it, and they said, do you know for sure they were even talking about you? Well, of course they were talking about me. I'm the most important person in the room. Again, no. Turns out I was carrying a grudge that didn't even exist. A grudge about something. I had actually been the one who had offended because I was thinking evil against them, and they weren't even talking about me. So analyze it, really identify the action. What is it that I'm upset about? What is it that I think has been done to me that is wrong? What is the nature? Then what is the nature of the action? This is number 2 under analyze. Try the best you can to decide, is this a mistake? Was this something that, the person didn't mean it? Not only did they mean it, but it wasn't a moral wrong. I like to use, they stepped on my foot because they didn't see me. They ignored me in the aisle, but it's not wrong not to shake someone's hand. I don't think they were purposely ignoring me. It hurt my feelings. I felt a little bit bad about it, but I need to let that go. I can remember one time being spoken to by someone whose wife was offended at something that she thought I thought. And when I talked to the husband about it, he said, of course, she was upset by this, and she should have been. And I said, no, she shouldn't have been, because I never thought or said what she thought I thought or said. So it's not a valid. It wasn't even a mistake. I didn't do anything, right? But many times people do. So analyze it. Is it a mistake? Is it a trespass? Intentional or unintentional? Did they commit a moral wrong against me? Did they lie to me? Did they, were they having a bad day and so they snubbed me at church? Or did they say something unkind to me? Was it a trespass? Does the person owe me something? Does this rise to the level of debt? And then fourthly, does it rise to the level of an offense? Again, an offense is something which it's a stumbling block, it's a scandal, it goes to the very depth of a person's soul, and it changes them. It is incredibly difficult. And we talked about that last week, but is it an offense that's happened? Secondly, ask. So I want to ask, do I know the intention? I know that they did that on purpose. How do you know they did it on purpose? Again, we love to impugn the motives of other people. Do you know for sure that they did it on purpose? Do I know that they meant to do this? What difference does it make? Well, it does make a little bit difference if I'm going to confront somebody. If I think somebody was rude to me on purpose, they intended to be rude, I'm probably going to follow in the act portion, I'm probably going to follow the steps of rebuking them, letting them know that what you did was wrong. But if I'm not sure, maybe I need to reach for charity instead and just let it go. They didn't mean it. They weren't even thinking about it. I'm not even going to bring it up because if I told them, they'd probably be hurt that they had hurt me. So ask, do I know the intention of this person? Was this person trying to hurt me? Again, this is more important at the lower levels. The higher level offenses or sins that you get into, it's pretty obvious there's an evil intention there. So, but maybe this will help. Secondly, am I viewing this accurately? I've already talked a little bit about this. It's kind of a checklist you can go through. Am I viewing this accurately? Is the way I'm feeling about this accurate to the situation? Now, someone might ask, well, how in the world, how do I know? How do I know what, for example, the appropriate response is? How do I know if I'm viewing it accurately? How do I know their intention? Pay attention here because this is really important. This is why I believe God intended for his people to live life in community. It is sometimes impossible for us to get to the heart of a matter with our own intellect and thinking. But when we have a community of people around us who love the truth, who love God, who love each other, we can bring our problems to them. And they can help us to see things from another point of view. There have been many times there have been times that I've been irritated at something my kids did, and my wife said, I don't think you're seeing this exactly the right way. I didn't like to hear that, but I'm glad that she would say it because then I could respond to my kids appropriately, rather than just through anger, or rather than responding and punishing them for something that they didn't do. I want to deal with what they did, and I want to deal with why they did. So this is why community is so important. A community of people can help us to see things accurately. Not only that, there are times that people think that someone else is offended against them, and in fact, they're the ones that have done the offending, or they're the ones that have done the trespassing. There are people, please hear me out here, but there are people who have left churches angry at the pastor or angry at somebody else in the church. They say, well, they offended me and they won't ask for my forgiveness. And in actuality, what happened is someone in the church, the pastor or someone in the church, approached them in love to express some concern over an area of their life, or they rebuked them, and the person took offense at it and left and walked away. And now they're waiting for an apology that's probably not coming, because the people you're angry at didn't do anything wrong. And so forgiveness is complex, and there is some difficulty. Many times pastors will stand in pulpits, and because they have positions of power, they'll tell stories, and it's oftentimes the case, and I try not to do it, but it's oftentimes that pastors are the heroes of their own stories. They never do anything wrong. It's always the other people that do things wrong. I try to tell stories where people see the mistakes that I've made and the times that I've had to ask for forgiveness, because I'm aware of the tendency and the great power that comes with a platform like that. And so sometimes pastors tell stories about church members that have left as if the act of leaving somebody's church is in itself a wrong thing, because pastors could never be wrong. But many pastors are wrong. And pastors also sin against people. But many times pastors don't want to be confronted or rebuked. Right? So in a community of people, it keeps pride from entering in, because we have people around us who love us, who say, I don't think you're seeing that right, and let me help you with that. Okay, so number one is analyze. Number two, ask questions. Once you know what the nature of a thing is, then ask questions about that thing. And then thirdly, act. First, act in obedience. If it's an area that requires love, act in love. If God requires forgiveness, act in forgiveness. Secondly, act in faith. Act in faith that where God says, forgiven, you shall be forgiven. Act in faith when God says, when you forgive a debt, I will repay you. I will take care. I will make up the lack. I want you to love, and I will help you. If there's a wrong, I'll deal with it, but it's better for you to forgive. Also, again, thirdly, act in community. And I already just described what it is that I mean by that. So hopefully that makes sense. Act in community. All right, so there it goes. Number 2, the second screen for you today, analyze, ask, and act. So we have contemplate, assimilate, and allocate. And then the second thing that you can do is analyze, ask, and act. All right? And if you want this list, send me an email, nlsbcmaine@gmail.com, and I'll send you this slide for you to be able to write down if you have, or pause and just write it down on a piece of paper. That'd probably be easier. What about this now? Let's move into talking about offenses. And I want to let you know this is going to go a little bit longer today because we still have some stuff to get through here, and it's really important. What about offenses? This is a cartoonish of an illustration, but I think it's important. What do we do about offenses? Here we have a bully pulling a little girl's hair and a boy stepping in and grabbing his wrist to stop him from doing that. So we see pain that's being caused, the one causing the pain, and one who's intervening. Now, if you look at the boy in the red shirt, if you look at his right fist, it looks like he's about ready to cold cock that bully if he doesn't stop pulling that girl's hair. Maybe it's his sister. Maybe it's just a helpless little girl in the playground. Maybe it's someone in the neighborhood. It could represent a lot of things. But this opens up the topic for us of offenses, is what are we supposed to do about those big things, those offenses, those deep moral wrongs, those things where justice has been violated deeply, someone has been taken advantage of. Is it right for us to step in? Should the little girl who's crying be told, hey, yes, the bully's hurting you, but you should just forgive him? Or is it wrong for the boy in the red shirt to step in and stop the pain from happening? Because now he's expressing vengeance. He's not expressing Christian love and forgiveness. And there are a lot of people who would like us to think that it's wrong ever to step in with force to stop evil from happening. Because we're supposed to be love and, judge not, that you be not judged, and all of that kind of nonsense. No, I like this illustration for many reasons, primarily because it causes us to think, what is to be done about offenses when someone in a position of power or strength or relationship or access takes advantage of that relationship to perpetrate evil for their own purposes with evil intention? What do we do in those situations? That's important. Over the years, I've learned that many of the long-term wounds that people carry are a result of the failure to obtain justice. Because iniquity abounds, the love of many shall wax cold, is a verse of Scripture. Many long-term wounds people carry are a result of their failure to obtain justice. Now, I don't mean that they had somehow a failure, but that they sought justice and justice was denied to them. There are things in that category of offenses that are so egregious, that are so wrong, that are so contrary to the principles of justice and what is right, that justice is needed. And that when we fail to obtain justice on the part of the person who has been wounded to that level, then we rob them very often of the ability to be healed of that wound. Now, I want to stop here and say the grace of God is sufficient for all of that. If you have failed to obtain justice, God's grace, you don't have to stay wounded for your entire life. And I'm going to get into what you can do here in a minute. But I want you to know that forgiveness does not, especially as it rises to the level of offenses, not only is there no verse in the Bible that says you should forgive offenses necessarily, especially if that forgiveness means a lack of seeking justice. I heard someone say, I don't remember who it was that said it, but they said you should forgive your offender and testify against them in court. Okay, I can accept that. I'm not even sure you need to forgive your offender, especially when we're not just talking about someone offended me, they said something mean. I am very clearly delineating offenses, using it in the biblical sense of someone who has cast a stumbling block in front of someone else. They've caused them to fall. They've wounded their conscience. They have scandalized them. They have hurt them down to the very depths of their being. Think of things like sexual crimes. Think of things like crimes where someone in a position of power takes advantage of. Think of things where someone's life savings, for example, has been stolen from someone. Think of those people who take advantage of the elderly through the telephone and the internet and rob them of their hard-earned money. That makes me angry, and that makes God angry too. And it's not okay for us to just say, well, we should just forgive them. No, when it rises to the level of offense, especially with those who are poor, or those who are needy, or those who are helpless, which is why I said positions of power and authority, people under their care would classify as that. All right, so understand that many of the long-term wounds that people carry, including some of you who are watching, may be a result of the failure to obtain justice. So how do we obtain justice? Luke 18 verses 1 through 8 tells us the story. Jesus begins Luke 18 by saying that he's telling a story that men ought always to pray and not to faint. And then he tells the story of the unjust judge. Let me go ahead and go over to Luke chapter 18, and I'll pull that up here so you can look at that with me. Luke chapter 18 and verses 1 through 8. Okay? Let's go over here. Luke 18, 1 through 8. And he spake this parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint, saying, there was in a city a judge, which feared not God, neither regarded man. And there was a widow in that city, and she came unto him, saying, avenge me of mine adversary. You see the language of vengeance here? Avenge me of mine adversary. The person this is a widow, she's been taken advantage of, and she lacks the ability to make it right. And so she's going to the proper authorities. And he would not for a while. But afterwards he said within himself, though I fear not God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubleth me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. And the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge saith. He said, do you hear what he said? Listen to that. Now he said, and shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him, though he bear long with them? This is not a passage to equate God like an unjust judge, where God wants you to, come and he doesn't really care, but if you pester him enough, he'll do it. He's saying, since God is not an unjust judge, he is a righteous judge. If even an unjust judge will eventually do what is right, even more than that, the God of heaven, who loves justice, will avenge his elect. Notice it doesn't say God, the righteous judge, will tell his elect, get over it, forgive them, and move on. There are things which require vengeance. There are things which require vengeance. And so it's important for us to recognize that there is a tremendous wound, a double wound that happens when someone offends against a person, and then justice is denied them. And so where is a person to go when that happens? Well, I think first of all, it's very important for us to recognize that God cares very deeply about justice, especially to those who were taken advantage of. So let me look here. I want to pull up a couple of other verses and have you look at them with me. Thank you. And again, if you're running out of time, pause this and come back and watch the rest of it later. But if you have time, keep listening. We're sitting at 38 minutes here right now. So Proverbs chapter 22 and verse number 22. Let me see if I got that right. And pull that up here. Rob not the poor, up here starting in verse 22. Rob not the poor because he is poor, neither oppress the afflicted in the gate. So he's talking to people obviously who are in positions of power. Don't take advantage. Why? For the Lord will plead their cause and spoil the soul of those that spoiled them. This is vengeance. Notice there's nothing here about, well, you can hope you'll be forgiven, but God will respond. And while this is pulled up, let me just go ahead and pull up Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse number 8. Ecclesiastes 5 and verse number 8 says, "If thou seest the oppression of the poor, and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province," like if you see these kinds of wrongs happening, if you see human trafficking, if you see sex trafficking, if you see injustice in the courts, if you see people having their lands and homes stolen from them, if you see these kinds of wrongs being done, marvel not at the matter. For he that is higher than the highest, remember, positions of power and authority, he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. So in other words, Solomon is saying here, God is paying attention to these things. And if you see that, take knowledge of this fact. God is watching and he will repay. God is watching and he will repay. That's important for us to remember. Romans chapter 12, verses 19 through 21 says, "Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. First, avenge not yourself. Give place unto wrath. Don't take vengeance into your own hands." Let me grab something here real quick. Hold tight. I have here a sword, and I don't know if you'll be able to see it, and I'm not sure which way is the right way for you to read it. You might not be able to read that, but it says, "Vengeance is mine. Vengeance is mine." It's a little sword I got as an illustration because here's what happens. And I'm probably going to get tagged on YouTube for holding up a sword on the screen. Here's what happens. We have someone who is deeply offended against us, and we want to exact justice because our sense of justice has been violated. And there's something in us that wants to rush in and avenge ourselves. Here's the problem with that. Wow, now I'm hiccuping. The problem with that is that when we take vengeance upon ourselves, when we take it upon ourselves rather to exact vengeance, we oftentimes will go too far, we won't carry it out justly because there's no way we can know all the details, and oftentimes our anger will cause us to go too far, and then ourselves become the offenders. God is the one who said, "Vengeance belongs to me," but then he says, "I will repay, saith the Lord." I will repay. Vengeance is mine. Notice what he says in that at the bottom of the screen there. I will repay. Who will God repay? He will repay the one who has offended you. I'm not again. The word offense is being clearly used there, not as if someone just because your boss was smart alecky with you doesn't mean God's angry with him. I'm talking about severe offenses. Language is important. God says, "I will repay." Let's go on. "Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good." Now, I think the last part, overcoming evil with good here, is talking about evil that could affect us and get into our own hearts and souls. And when we do right, we overcome that evil with good. And yes, God does say here, so there's a right way to respond to your enemy. Essentially what Jesus is saying here, or what Paul is saying, and Jesus talked about the same thing, is do not respond to those who offend you in the manner in which they acted against you. There's a different spirit in which we're to act. This, of course, assumes that you have the ability to do these things or that you're not still in danger, but love your enemy. Do good. Don't become like your offender. There's a huge temptation in the heart of human beings to become like the person who hurt them so that they can hurt them back. There are all kinds of movies and television shows that have this theme in it, that to execute vengeance, the avenging angel becomes like the person that hurt them. And violence for violence. But as a result, we watch it and we think many times they end up crossing a line because it's hard for human beings to exact right justice. This is why God created governments among men, by the way. And this is why Paul in the book of Romans, when talking about governments, says they don't bear the sword in vain. Why do they have the sword? They were given the sword for the punishment of evildoers. So what happens if either the government itself is the evildoer or the government fails to provide justice against? What happens if you're offended against and there's no justice in the courts? There's no justice in the life of the person who hurt you. Well, then Ecclesiastes, there's someone higher, and God says here in Romans 12, I will repay, saith the Lord. So then he says, they will heap coals of fire on his head. I've heard so many explanations about that, because there's something about heaping coals of fire on our head, on someone's head, that makes us so uncomfortable that we want to turn it into a good thing. Like, wow, it's really a blessing. Like, there's really, coals of fire sounds bad, but it's really good. Actually, I think it's bad. Let me show you why I think it's bad. Psalm 140, verses 9 through 13. I want you to notice what the Bible says here. As for the head of those that compass me about. So we have the word head here, right? As for the head of them, let the mischief of their own lips cover them. Let burning coals fall upon them. So he's talking about the head and burning coals falling. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, it does. Let them be cast into the fire, into deep pits, that they rise not up again. Let not an evil speaker be established in the earth. Evil shall hunt the violent man to overthrow him. That's justice, isn't it? I know, the psalmist said, that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and the right of the poor. Surely the righteous shall give thanks unto thy name. The upright shall dwell in thy presence. Where's forgiveness listed here, by the way? What's at stake with these offenses perpetrated by people in positions of power, strength, relationship, or access against those who are under their authority or under their power? Deep woundings, deep injustices, God says, I'm going to repay. But here's the thing. What's the whole heaping coals of fire and doing good? It means giving the sword of vengeance over to God, letting it out of our hands, and we just respond as God would respond, or as God would have us to respond. We respond opposite to them, but not so that they can just get away with it. But because when we give the sword of vengeance into God's hands and say, Lord, I'm not going to take vengeance as my right, God says, but I will. I will repay. Vengeance is actually my job. When we try to do God's job, we end up harming ourselves. When we let God do his job, he dispenses perfect justice, evil against the evil, coals of fire. That's a symbol of justice, by the way. Coals of fire, fire and brimstone. God will judge those who have offended deeply. I want you to hear this, and I want you to understand it. We're going to go a whole hour in today's message, but I can't help it. This is really important. Understand this, please. God will punish offenses. There will be justice, if not in this world, then in the next. Because God has promised, I will repay. Well, what if the person is a Christian and they don't get punished in this life, and then once they go to heaven, then there's nothing? God will reward the evildoers, if not in this life, then in the next. I'm not interested in relieving the stress of an offender. For what I mean by that, I want to bring comfort to those who have been deeply hurt and wounded, that God knows you can let go of the need to see them punished. You can let go of that and walk in peace, walk in forgiveness. You can do good and not allow the evil to overcome you, because God will bring justice. I wish I had more time to talk about it, but we must move on. So here we go again. I'm just bringing this back up for you to look at. Now, I want to pull up one more verse, because I want you to see this, because people say, well, that's Old Testament, that's not New Testament. But no, it's not the case. Jesus on the cross said, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. I believe intention has a lot to do with it. Stephen, when he was being stoned in Acts chapter 4 or 5, somewhere in there, when Stephen's being stoned, he said, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. Again, I believe he knew they were responding ignorantly, and he loved them. But it's not always that case. I want to show you in 1 Timothy, is it 1 Timothy? 2 Timothy, rather. 2 Timothy chapter number 4 and verse number 14. I'm going to pull this up on the screen so that you can see it. Here's the Apostle Paul at the end of his second letter to Timothy. The end of his second letter to Timothy. And I want you to notice this. Alexander the coppersmith. All right, so here's verse number 14. Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. It wasn't a mistake. This rises to the level of an offense. Alexander we're not told what it was, but it was severe. Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil, so I forgave him, because that's what Jesus would want me to do. But that's not what Paul says. The Lord reward him according to his works. You know what Paul is speaking of here? Cosmic justice. He did me much evil, but I'm not going to take the sword. The Lord reward him according to his works. This is David standing and speaking to Saul when Saul was pursuing him and saying, the Lord judge between me and thee, but I will not raise my hand against you. And God did bring judgment on Saul for the wrong that he did. So Paul goes on to say in verse 15 here, of whom be thou ware also, for he hath greatly withstood our words. This is an evil person. And so Paul is telling Timothy, be aware of this guy. He's not good. He's evil. And God, I'm turning him over to God and asking God to reward him according to his works. Oh, well, the apostle, Paul, Jesus forgave you, so you should be forgiving Alexander the coppersmith. That's not exactly how Paul viewed that. He said, he did me much evil. The Lord reward him according to his works. But then look right here in the next verse. Paul said, at my first answer, no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. I pray God that it may not be laid to their charge. Isn't that interesting? When Paul was giving an answer before the courts, he said, all of my friends, they were afraid and they left, they ran away. Nobody was a witness for me. But he said, but God stood with me. But notice what he said. I pray God that it may not be laid to their charge. You know, not to stand by your friend, that's wrong. But Paul said, what they did to me was somehow different than what Alexander the coppersmith did. Remember, what's the nature of this? What was the intention of this? They weren't trying to hurt Saul. They just got overcome by their own fear, and they made a choice that did hurt Saul or did hurt Paul. But it wasn't out of any sense of evil or any sense of desire to destroy. And so Paul said he could forgive, and he said, I'm asking God not to lay it to their charge. Lord, let it go. Lord, let it go. Isn't that interesting that in 3 verses, back to back, the Apostle Paul talks about 2 actions that were against him that were wrong. One, he said, the Lord reward him according to his work, and turns right around 2 verses later and says, I pray God it would not be laid to their charge. Because the intentions of the action, as well as the level of the action, have an impact on our response to it. Okay, so we are finished for today. I'm at 53 minutes. We've covered a lot of territory, and I know that you may have questions. I want you to know that you can email me and ask me any questions you have, or call me, or come and see me. If after hearing these messages, you want to forgive, but you're really struggling with forgiveness and you want someone to talk to, I think I can help you. I know this, God does not want you walking in the prison of bitterness and pain and anger. He loves you, and he promises that the evil that was done to you, the real and true evil, for those of you facing that, he will make that right if you give it over to him. I believe that if we take the sword of vengeance in our own hands, God takes his hands off and he says, I don't want you to do that. That's not your job. It's like a little kid swinging a sword around. Someone's going to get hurt. But if we give that over to God and we say, I'm going to focus on being the kind of person you called me to be, even towards those who are mistreating me, God says, good. Now you stand back and watch what I will do. I will repay. Give that sword to God. He knows how to wield it, and he understands the need for justice. Hannah said in 1 Samuel chapter number 2, I think it is, maybe it's chapter 3, she said, God is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. He knows, and the word weighed there means to level out, by the way. God balances the scales. He will do what is right. Justice will come in this life or in the next when we give that wrong over to God. Next week, I'm going to talk to you about learning to walk in the spirit of forgiveness. Learning how to forgive and then go, what's next? Some of you have been in bondage to bitterness and pain and anger for so long you wouldn't even know what's next. And we're going to talk about that next week as we wrap up this series. Hey, look, thank you so much for taking time to watch these messages and to listen along with me. My prayer is that God would help you to assimilate the information and be set free from that which is holding you back. And if I can help in any way, please let me know. Until next time then, thank you for watching, and God bless you.